Welcome everybody again. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Bhavna from SOAS, University of London. She has been working on Central Asia and different migration patterns for a long time, also diasporas, but your last research is about migration in the Eurasian space in general.
Yes, ongoing,
ongoing. And today you will be presenting labor migration from Central Asia to Russia, laws, policies, and impacts. And I do not need to highlight how current and contemporary and important this issue is to all Central Asian states concerned. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone for being here. And also thank you for your endurance, because you have already been through long hours of sitting and imbibing so much information and ideas and concepts which have been presented to you. So I will continue the trend that my colleagues have already established. So as Jeroen said, I have been working on Central Asia for quite some time. I think probably, even while many of you were in kindergarten, I have been working on these topics ever since then. My previous research has been on Kazakhstan, language, national identity, ethnic politics, a little bit of authoritarianism, which I don't like, as Adrian had pointed out. I moved away from studies of authoritarian consolidation I started looking at migrants, initially in Kazakhstan, migrants coming from Uzbekistan, from Kyrgyzstan, also a little bit from Tajikistan. They were not very visible, but I knew where they were. And if you look for migrants and if you're aware of who is where, you kind of know where they are and what they do. So I did enough work on that, and then I started looking at the larger picture, which is migrants in Russia. So labor migrants from Central Asia into Russia. Having said that, it's important to keep in mind that all kinds of migrants come to Russia, predominantly from the neighboring regions, from Ukraine, from Belarus, Moldova, Central Asian states, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so on. I couldn't focus on everything, so this is what I have chosen to focus on. And I've been working on this since 2011 or so, more or less full time. I have other research projects, but I won't really talk about those things. So they are competing for time together with my focus on migration, but that's something different. Coming back to labor migration, or the general issue of migration. I recall a few years ago, a cousin of mine in India, who is a businessman, who is a very well-traveled businessman, asked me, "What are you doing in Russia? You keep going there." So I told him, "Well, I'm working on migration." So he said, "Why migration? Who goes to Russia? I don't know anyone who wants to migrate to Russia." So, and he has well-traveled, he has been to Russia, so he knew. And he said, "I know Russians who want to get out of Russia. So why? What are you studying?" So I said, "Yeah, I'm looking at Central Asian migrants from Uzbekistan, from Kyrgyzstan, from Tajikistan, working there." So he said, "Yeah, but that's the same country, isn't it?" Well, I said, "Now, they used to be part of the same country, but not anymore." So he said, "So what do they do? Do they need visas?" I said, "No, they don't need visas, but then they have to encounter so many other problems." So then he said, "It's just like the Nepalese and the Bangladeshis coming to India to work, right?" So I said, okay, my cousin is beginning to understand my research. I said, "Yes." And then I thought to myself, if India had, say, 1/6 of the numbers of people that Russia has, and if India had a declining population that Russia has, and also kind of uneven, declining, not very rapidly, certainly not growing economy, and if there were more Nepalese and Bangladeshis and others coming into India, then probably the situation in India would resemble what we see in Russia. So anyway, so with that, what I want to point out to you is that what we are seeing in Russia today is not just migration, but a certain kind of migration from what region that used to be part of Russia. We are also seeing large wave of out-migration from Russia. And we are also seeing that nobody is particularly happy, neither Russia while receiving migrants, nor really migrants who are working in Russia. I mean, I'm saying that as a broad generalization. People are there because they don't have better options. So migrants go to Russia from Central Asia because that's the best option currently they can find. Ideally, they would like to go elsewhere. So when I interview them, so many Tajiks and Uzbeks have asked me, so what do I need to do to get to UK? How did you go to the UK? So can I go and study there? You know, so they have these aspirations, and that's important. So in my lecture, I would try to touch upon a lot of these broad themes. In simple words, who are these migrants? How do they go there? Why do they go? It's not just a matter of their individual decisions, but it's also a movement that's facilitated by structural forces, by larger systemic forces. And what is happening in this region is something that we call it's migration that's happening within the Eurasian system. So there is the concept of Eurasian migration system that links Russia, Ukraine, other states, and Central Asian states. Then we'll look at the number of migrants, the terminology, the categories which are deployed to describe them. Then we need to talk about what Russia's own migration regulatory regime is, or the attempt to regulate migration is, what are the laws, how legal are the laws. You know, Scott Newton had talked a lot about constitutionalism, law. Abel talked about informality, formality. There are formal laws, but what actually happens in practice. So all that laws and the legality, the questionable legality, the institutions, the policy and discourse in Russia, and also progressively the coercive regime, the migration control regime that is coming into place, with the state resorting to deportations, detentions, and the increasing talk about migrants as a threat to security. So what does that mean? How do we decipher that? And the effects of migration on Central Asian states themselves, on the socio-economic system, cultural effects, effects on the families, the question of migrants becoming radicalized, and then finally, you know, migration is an ongoing process. So what kind of, based on what we see today, what kind of conclusions do we draw? What sort of observations do we make? And how do we try to enhance our understanding of migration, not just in terms of what's happening, but also what is the concept and what kind of conceptual categories do we deploy? So if we look at the post-Soviet, not a very nice, helpful term, but I mean useful in some ways. If we look at the post-1991 context, then what kind of changes do we encounter? What sort of changes became visible in the 1990s? In contrast to the Soviet Union, which was not a migration-friendly state. Now, you know, a little bit about the Soviet Union. So you know, I told you about my cousin who asked me, you know, is there migration? Who wants to go to Russia to migrate? If you ask the same question about the Soviet Union, practically nobody wanted to go to Soviet Union. I mean, it wasn't even an option of going and migrating. Similarly, for the people from the Soviet Union, most people wanted to get out, but it wasn't even possible to get out. So you could be exiled from the Soviet Union if you are a dissident, and if you're lucky enough not to be sent to the concentration camp, but lucky enough to be allowed to leave. So the state had to allow, you needed permission of the state to leave, to exit. So it was a closed system. It didn't allow in-migration, and there wasn't a possibility of citizens voluntarily choosing to out-migrate, except for very small number of exceptions. Post-1991, what we see is suddenly everything has opened up. So people are moving. They are moving within. In the Soviet Union, you could not freely move within. So, you know, if you are in Uzbekistan and if you want to go to Moscow because, you know, you speak Russian and you think you have better prospects, you couldn't just go on your own. The state had to assign a job to you. You needed a propiska registration permit, which will allow you to get housing, to have access to various facilities. Without that, you couldn't really just go on your own. Some people did go on their own, but they had, through bribing and everything else, maybe some things were possible, but only for a small number of people. But after 1991, we see a lot of movement that's taking place, even though these new boundaries and sovereign borders, sovereignty is coming into effect. The first wave of movement that we see, which is very noticeable, is of ethnic Russians moving from Central Asian states, particularly from Kazakhstan, to Russia. So about 4 million people within the first decade moved, predominantly ethnic Russians, to Russia. We also see an increase in return to so-called ethnic homeland. So for Russians in Kazakhstan or in Tajikistan, Russia was seen as their homeland, though many of them had never lived in Russia. Kin state, Ukrainian in Kazakhstan, Ukraine is identified as their kin state, but many Ukrainians or people of Ukrainian Russian background opted to go to Russia. Germans in Kazakhstan, Germany is their kin state. Okay, 75% of them over time emigrated to Germany because conditions are favorable and it's a desirable destination. A lot of Koreans from Kazakhstan did not migrate to Korea because they got some identity card and some card for residency and other facilities, but they didn't migrate. But predominantly we saw this ethnic migration, and also there was the migration of the compatriots, the Russian government inviting the соотечественники, people who were of Russian background, who had some direct linkage through spouse or through family ties, even if you're not full-fledged Russian, but if you have ancestry, Russian ancestry. It's a very broad and expanding category, but you could move to Russia. So predominantly this migration was ethnic in character. It's something that Rogers Brubaker, very well-known sociologist studying these processes, describes this process as something very typical of that happens after the breakdown of various multinational empires. So ethnic unmixing, because ethnic mixing in the empire itself was very, very much induced the discourse of multinationality and internationalism and so on. So those processes are happening. So in this, here what we see, this is only up to the year 2015, but you can get some sense of what are the immigration flows are. So in terms of immigration, you see in the 1990s, there's a peak here, so that's the Russian speakers going to Russia. Then 1999 to 2000, 2003, the numbers stabilize, they become low because most people had already left and others who had stayed didn't want to leave. Then a next wave of immigration also begins from 2004-05 onwards, and there is an increase, and this is the immigration of labor migrants that I'll talk about next. Also, you find the emigration rates from Russia increase, and I mean they also fluctuate. So high emigration, then early 2002-03, the numbers are low, and then from 2010 onwards, and if we had the figures for 2015 onwards, it's even higher. And 2015 onwards, the immigration is lower, so that line will go down further. So what's happening after 2000s? If 1990s was the phase in which most migrations were ethnic migrations, here is the beginning of labor migration. And also what is happening within the Russian economy, again, the Russian economy undergoes, after going through a phase of decline, 98, 99, the financial crisis, then from 2001-2, the economy starts picking up. So Putin is very lucky because his coming to power also coincides with Russia's economic rise. These are coincidental factors. He wasn't responsible for the global rise in oil prices and Russia's prosperity for next few years, rising prosperity for next few years. There's also emigration and depopulation trends happening within Russia, so lower, significantly low, practically zero birth rates in Russia, except for in Chechnya and Dagestan and other republics. Also the high mortality rates and high emigration rates. At the same time, Russian cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg and other cities are experiencing much higher need for migrant labor because local Russians are not taking up the jobs which are considered low prestige, low paying, cleaning, construction, working in the bazaars, and even fixing things, janitors and plumbers and all these kinds of jobs. So the pay is little, and a lot of Russians were managing, there was also high unemployment or underemployment or disguised unemployment. So those niches are being filled by labor migrants from Central Asia, who already comprise about 60% of all existing labor migrants in the country. Roughly speaking, these numbers, and I'll talk a bit more about the numbers, we don't have reliable statistics, and there cannot be reliable statistics for these categories. I'll talk why a little bit later. But roughly 2.1 million Uzbeks, about 1.1 Tajiks, and 650,000, maybe more, Kyrgyz are currently working in Russia, or at one time they are in Russia because there's a lot of movement in and out. So what we see in 2000s, by the end of 2000s, is that labor migration from Central Asia is becoming a systemic process. So that's why it's useful for us to talk about the Eurasian migration system, because this migration is happening within this one system. This is just a picture that gives you just a snapshot of migrants. I mean, there's so many such pictures you find, but it's just one thing I found in my collection to show that how migrants are recognizable. This doesn't mean that we should have stereotypes of migrants, because there are a lot of migrants who are not dressed like this, who are not carrying these kinds of bags, who are walking around just like you and I, we are all dressed. So, but there is that stereotype and the visibility of migrant that you can see here. And of course, in terms of their facial features, they don't resemble Slavic faces, so they stand out. I just have this picture. I mean, there's so many of these chaikhana and cafes and tea houses in Moscow and other cities. The reason why I have this is because this was one of the first places that I met a migrant leader in 2012. And it's near the Paveletsky Vokzal, the Pavelyevskaya station. It's very convenient, and there is a lot of migration documents, sale and kind of transaction activities go on at the Pavelyetsky Vokzal. You can buy all kinds of documents that you need. I mean, less so now, but much more common then. So I still go, so I've had many interviews in this. So it's just a typical kind of scene you'll find in any Russian city, chaikhana, and you have the migrants hanging out there, and you have other businesses there as well. Eurasian migration system. The reason why most people outside don't yet know about what kind of migration takes place in Russia is because a lot of this migration is still internal in the system. So if you look at statistics, they say that after the US, Russia is the second largest, Russia was the second largest migrant receiving state until late 2000s. Over the last 3 years, Germany has replaced Russia, and Russia is the third largest migrant receiving state. But that doesn't mean Russia is migrant-friendly state. So US is an immigration state, despite what Trump is trying to do, and it will remain so. Germany has become an immigration state from being very close to migration in 1990s and earlier. Russia, we don't know, but it has fallen, but it's still a large, the third largest migration receiving state, but the world doesn't really recognize Russia as a migrant receiving state because of the closed nature of migration happening within that system. So 85% of the mobility is taking place within the former Soviet boundaries. There is a visa-free system that prevails. So, Uzbeks or Tajiks don't need a visa to go to Russia. But that doesn't mean that life is easy. I'll tell you in a minute. The legal regulatory system is quite weak. It is underdeveloped, but also we see lots of different contradictory laws. So it's actually very paradoxical, very contradictory, and very confusing. Especially for migrants. I mean, even for people like me who are studying the legal process, it's very confusing. And the laws are very complex. And the more complexity of laws you have, inefficient regulation, inefficient bureaucracy you have, the result is informality, informal implementation of law. So those are the processes we encounter. Visa-free regime means you can go to another country without needing a visa, but within 7 days, you have to register with the police. Now, how many days, that varies depending on which country you are from, and those kind of requirements keep changing, whether 2 days or 3 days or 5 days. So when the World Cup football was going on, suddenly the Russian government came out with a law that all migrants had to register within 24 hours. How do you register in 24 hours? You arrive Saturday night. There was no information that, where do you go on Sunday or Saturday. Anyway, then they revised it, then they extended. So these sort of things are happening all the time. So migrants have to register. So it's not, and then they need a visa, they need a work permit in order to work legally. So Eurasian migration system, what are the factors? Why are the migrants there? Basically, what we see is there are the existing center periphery or metropole periphery linkages. So from Soviet times, already those linkages were established. So in terms of interdependence of economies, the existing transportation links. The Soviet Union in 1970s, early 1980s was trying to channel movement of Uzbeks from rural areas to central parts of Russia, to even parts of Siberia, because those were labor deficit regions. But it was not successful in terms of bringing the Uzbeks, because the Uzbeks didn't know the language. They were reluctant to leave their comfortable Mahalla family settings, and they were scared of being in some Russian, in the middle of nowhere, in a Russian-speaking environment. So even a centralized administrative command economy of the Soviet state was not successful in doing that. But with the advent of market forces, the market factors have facilitated, have opened up those possibilities. So now the Uzbeks from rural areas who don't really know Russian very well are willing to go to some central part of Siberia or Russian Far East or some village somewhere near Moscow or in Moscow city to work. So these are the existing transport connections. There are also developmental wage disparities. So the wage that you earn in Russia was much, much higher. So now it's not as high, but it was still significantly higher. There is also the demographic labor complementarity. So Russia needs labor force, and Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan have surplus labor force, particularly surplus young working population. There's the common cultural and linguistic environment. So even if you don't know Russian very well, you still understand some Russian. You still know what propiska means. You still know what vis-a-vis regime is. You still know where do you have to go to get, разрешение and all those things. So there are these common terminologies. And most important, there are networks. Migrants, if a migrant, all migrants, they know somebody somewhere. So they tend to go where they know somebody from their village, from their neighborhood, some distant uncle. But does all this mean that we are seeing the beginning of emergence of a common labor market, something like an enlarged EU structure where, from Poland you go to England to work, to Britain to work, or from Bulgaria you go to Italy to work? Not quite. There is also the Eurasian Economic Union, which is being forged as a interlinked entity with also some kind of open migration, open labor, free mobility of labor. But what does that mean? The members of Eurasian Economic Union, Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan have been the founding member states. In 2014, Armenia became the member of Eurasian Economic Union. Then Kyrgyzstan became a member. And when I said became a member, there were also all kinds of geopolitical factors which left the governments of these countries with very little choice except to become members. So what are the advantages they get in terms of migration? There are some removal of tariffs and custom barriers, but particularly for people citizens of these states, they do not need a patent, which is the work permit, in order to work. So they can simply go and find work. They of course have to follow up other procedures, but they don't need to do the elaborate paperwork of acquiring a work permit. So the Kyrgyz citizens now, since 2015, can freely work, and that has made some things simpler for Kyrgyz, but it has also made many things far more challenging and difficult for the Kyrgyz citizens in Russia. I'll talk about that a bit later. So this is a question mark, maybe something for us to ask further on in further reading. Has the Eurasian Economic Union eased the mobility of labor? Will it still expand to include Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, which are the two largest migrant sending states to Russia. There are some negotiations about Tajikistan may be dragged into the Eurasian Economic Union, but we don't know. Uzbekistan has resolutely denied, and Uzbekistan is far more autonomous in terms of its own foreign policy making. In terms of just overall view, numbers and statistics, there are problems with numbers. I'll talk about that a bit later. But roughly, it's estimated that 11.7 million migrants work in Russia. And out of these, about 6.5 to 8 million are labor migrants. So others may have been long settled, they may be, the question arises, what's the difference between migrant and a labor migrant? Something I'll talk later. About 4 million total are from Central Asia. Now, when we look at Central Asians and all migrants, then you ask the question, so, how many of these, maybe they are Tajiks or Uzbeks or Kyrgyz, but how many of them have now become Russian citizens or have acquired residency, temporary or long-term in Russia? And if they have acquired this, are they counted as migrants? There's no clear answer. How many are documented, unregistered, illegal? All these terms, undocumented, documented, unregistered, registered, legal, illegal, are also problematic. I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Terminology, again, who is a migrant, an immigrant, a labor migrant? There is no clear legal terminology. And most important, in terms of counting, the state doesn't have one mechanism. So one way in which Russia's Ministry of External Affairs keeps a record of people coming in. So they have, when you enter Russia, you have to fill out a migration form, migraционная карточка. So you write down your name and the date you entered, and then you get that record, so it says so the Ministry of External Affairs has data which says X many number of people entered and X many number of people left, exited Russia. But what if you entered 5 times and then exited 4 times, so that's counted as, a migrant. So anyway, so the method of counting it's very rudimentary, it's very problematic, but it's something, one needs some method, so that sort of method exists. So who is unregistered? So if you didn't register after arriving within 7 days, but there is a document that somebody entered, so you become unregistered. Or maybe you registered, but you didn't know that your registration is not valid because somebody, your uncle's friend or somebody sold it to you. So you are unregistered. Or your registration has lapsed and you are still there. So again, so that is unregistered. Or you lost your passports. A lot of people voluntarily lost their passports because they had lost their registration. So they, this was before everything was entered in the centralized database. So, you lose your passport. There were lots of Uzbeks who started losing their passports in 2006 and 7 because they had overstayed. But now that's less common. Also, these migrants were described as Gastarbeiter initially, the word German, Gastarbeiter, because, the Gastarbeiter is used for somebody in Germany of Muslim origin, somebody who culturally doesn't really fit in, socially doesn't fit in. A Gastarbeiter is presumed to be, is a male who is presumed to be just one single worker. He doesn't have any other identity except being a worker. He's not supposed to have family. But slowly the family started coming in, and of course the term Gastarbeiter was then no longer used in Germany, and Germany's migration system started changing significantly over time. But the Soviet Union, in Russian context, they imbibed the term Gastarbeiter. But for a variety of reasons, it's not used now, and now they're simply using the word migrant to refer to just anyone. And sometimes a migrant can also be a Russian from the Far East who has moved to Russia. So that person is also looked upon at times as a hostile person because he or she doesn't have any registration status. So there is no fixed term, but migrant is a general term that's used for any outsider, particularly Central Asians. Also, there cannot really be any fixed term or very reliable statistics because migration itself is a very dynamic process. The migrants are shifting from one category to another. They come as labor migrant. Then they may maybe get married to someone, they find a Russian spouse, or they may enter into a second marriage, they have a wife, back home there, marriage of conveniences to get documentation. So then they acquire Russian, the settlement there. So the categories are shifting. And in many cases, migrants who have acquired long-term status, but because of their facial profile, they are still categorized as migrant because they are not Slavic looking. So in terms of structure and composition, we see that from Tajikistan, from these 3 states, roughly 20 to 40% of young adults of working age are working abroad. And of those working abroad, about 90%, the 90% Tajiks who are working abroad are working in Russia. 80% of Kyrgyz who are working abroad are working in Russia. 70% of all Uzbeks working abroad are working in Russia. The remaining in Kazakhstan and some other states and small numbers. Migrants tend to come from rural areas. There are also urban migrants. I mean, there is a stereotype of migrants as doing the low skill work. But there are, what is lost here is the attention to migrants who are highly educated and who are working in IT and in universities and research and who are working as lawyers and who are working as engineers. So that is usually lost. But there is that stereotype. Also the migrants, because they come from rural areas, they are much more connected to their family, mahalla networks. These are mostly young men. So initially there were a lot of young men coming to collect money for the kalim, to get married and to buy houses. And then they got there and they got married and they bought the house. Then they came again because they were trying to collect money for their first child. And then they went back and they came again because the second child, and so on. So, so temporary migration turns into a repetitive ongoing movement. And initially there were men, but then families started coming in, women also started coming in. And we have the highest percentage of women migrants from Kyrgyzstan, about 20%. This is just to give you an idea. I mean, there's so many, but I just happen to have this one picture. In Khabarovsk, it was very cold in Russian Far East. And this migrant didn't have any papers. A friend who I know arranged this interview. He was doing repairs at this Dom Otdikha, some holiday house, outskirts of city, and in the very cold premises, we managed to meet and interview him. So he didn't have any papers. I mean, he had outstayed his welcome, but he also knew local people who were helping him, so he trusted them. So he was not afraid to meet with them, but he told me, he said, I mean, I'm showing the picture here, but he won't get into trouble. So it's, I have more pictures that I'll tell you more stories about. So what we see that this kind of the labor migration increases in 2000s. And most of these labor movements are circular shuttle migratory movement. Also, the Russian government then starts imposing new laws and restrictions. So initially, there was practically no legal regulatory framework for this. But now they start introducing quota, they start introducing term limits. So what was common in the 2000s, what people would come, they were allowed to stay for one visit, they could stay up to 90 days. So once their 90-day period is getting over, they would cross the border into Ukraine or Belarus and come back the next day or sometimes the same day. So 4 migrants in a car go. The Ukrainian guards know very well why these 4 Tajik men are crossing the border. They would pay some money to the Ukrainian guard, they re-enter, they pay some money to the Russian guard, and they got their other 90-day permit. But then Russian government started introducing laws saying, if you are staying for 90 days, then you have to go back. You can't come back for another 90 days. So that stopped this whole practice of going to Ukraine, going to Belarus, and next border and re-entering. So one had to be outside of Russia. And many other restrictions. The Federal Migration Service, which is the migration regulating body, its functions started expanding with the expansion in number of migrants. It's also highly bureaucratic structure. It also saw, with the influx of migrants, many bureaucrats saw a very good opportunity for making money. So they would not shuffle papers quickly. So you are waiting for your registration, your term is running out. What do? You pay more to get your papers pushed. The shadow migration market. So again, the combination of not having clear set of laws, then very highly restrictive and complex laws, inefficient bureaucracy, also insufficient funding for the bureaucracy, the courts are not really doing their job. So the courts are, there is no pressure on the bureaucracy to work. They are not accountable to others. So the shadow migration market emerged, and there were a lot of people, intermediaries, посредники, who started selling all the kind of documents, or they have some connection with someone, so they would sell those papers. And there were lots of people, the former FMS employees set up their own legal firms to register migrants, to process all documents. And they started collecting money, and they started expediting all these things. So all these middlemen and fixers came along, and what we see is what in the migration works, many scholars have talked about this. So one of the prominent works is by Stephen Castles, who talks about the illegal migration industry that exists in almost every country, including the US, Canada, Western European. There are works on the EU as Migration Inc. There's very good work by Ruben Anderson, who has studied the border control regimes and how the border control, the privatized border control agencies work, and the kind of linkages that exist between all these people who transport migrants and the officials and other businesses which have emerged around these borders. So the same business emerged with these close linkages between the state officials, the FMS officials, all kind of middlemen who were former state employees, then some migrant groups and associations, businesses. So if you, even today, this was a few years ago, but even today, any metro station, Moscow, St. Petersburg, you go, you find these kinds of announcements, offers. So registratsiya, patent, people, these companies, you call these numbers, they offer you registratsiya, of course for a fee. Credit, you don't have money, here, no problem, no questions asked, free. Call this number, we offer you credit. Of course the credit is offered at huge percentage, which is not made clear. You want an apartment, a lot of Russian apartment owners, they don't want to give rent an apartment to migrants. But here, some of these are migrants firms themselves, so they are renting apartments. So you want registration, you want medical, whatever, so everything you can get. So this is the example of how the informal market is flourishing. Sorry, this paper wasn't very clear here. This one says, официальная регистрация. So those of you who know Russian, it should be официальная регистрация. But the announcement says официальная регистрация because it's presumably a Central Asian who doesn't know Russian language well. So it's clearly some Central Asian run enterprise. So they're selling this official, so it can't be an official registration. So anyway, so this is the example of how this market started thriving. So again, a few years later, the Russian government is trying to systematize the migration market. So the state is trying to step in and trying to end this informality. So in 2010, they introduced the patent system, the work permit. Now, the work permit initially was given only to somebody working for a private household. So you're working as a gardener in somebody's dacha, or a childminder, child carer, or cleaner, you get the patent. But what about, you're working with some supermarket, or you're working, construction company, anyway. So then people started buying this patent, but they were not working they would work few hours for an individual employer, and then rest of the time they would work for a company. But the patent became a source of legalization. Then the Russian government saw that, so they started further. Then they introduced a reform, and they allowed the patent for anyone working for any commercial firm. So that was an improvement. But the aim was that they could see that the migrants are bringing in money because the economy is improving with cheap labor, and they don't claim any tax, they don't claim any benefits. Secondly, they also realized, like in Saudi Arabia, so many other places, Gulf countries, you can start taxing migrants. And the money that was otherwise going to all these intermediaries, that, instead of them pocketing the money, the state can start getting the money. So the patent, everyone had to pay a monthly fee. So initially it was something like $30 per month. Then it went up and up. And the other purpose was also to legalize the migrants. But we find that the revenue generation and legalization kind of worked at cross purposes. They didn't really work in the same direction, that I'll show very quickly. So to get a patent, one needed all kinds of documents, passport, you had to have pass the medical, you have to have a medical insurance, and the medical test which shows that you don't have all these tuberculosis and all kinds of other communicable diseases, that you have no criminal record, that you have come here to work. And then from 2015, you have to pass a language test, test in Russian language, history, and culture. So you have to know when did the Crimean War happen, and who was Kutuzov, and all kinds of things. So the migrants started learning all these things. And anyway, so lots of, and then you have to give the fingerprints. Now, of course, it has become standard, but 6 years ago, 5 years ago, they introduced this, but they didn't have enough machines where people could give fingerprints. So, so you can't get your papers quickly. So then there were people who started selling fingerprints. So I remember talking to a Tajik woman who told me she had only 3 days left, and she just, couldn't find. So she finally bought a set of fingerprints. And she said, I could see that these were thick fingers. She's a dainty kind of, dainty fingers. And the person said, don't worry, nobody has had any problem with these. So, and with those, somebody else's fingerprint, she got her patent. So that's an example of how the market was still flourishing. The FEMES was not able to cope, and basically, the state started getting some money, but the intermediaries started getting even more money from this. And it's unclear what kind of legalization was taking place. So a lot of these bazaars are where migrants work. Some of them have patents, some others are just working informally. So this person didn't want to be seen because he didn't have a patent, whereas this person told me that he has all his documents, paryatke, all his papers in order. And these two were very happy. They said they have everything. They look happy. They were very happy working. And they said they have no problems. So what happened to the patent and work permit? And what kind of statistics do we have about the success or not so successful story of the patent? According to one set of data, in 2015, about a third of migrants actually had the patent. So all the rest of them were working in all kinds of ways without patent. And incidentally, also, it's not just the Central Asians, but it's also the Ukrainians and others who also have to have the patent. So I have only 10 minutes left, so I'll try to speed through this. So you see the numbers here. So the Uzbeks were the most conscious because they also knew that they are most likely to be targeted, so they need to have their documents in order. So even getting a patent doesn't mean that you are legal, because then you have to sign an official work contract with your employer. So if your employer tells you, I'll give you work, if you sign a work contract, I'll pay you 500 pounds, say 40,000 rubles. But if you don't sign a contract, I'll give you cash, I'll give you 60,000 rubles. So of course the migrant opts to take 60,000 rubles, but he doesn't sign the contract, so he's illegal. So he's still counted as an illegal despite having a patent. The Kyrgyz don't need patents, but they often forget about registering, they forget about having to sign work contracts, they forget that their term of stay has come to end and they still have to renew their status, so they often encounter all sorts of problems. Also what we find, again, that the patent acquisition rate vary from city to city, and the stringency also varies. And about 52% of all patents sold were in Moscow and St. Petersburg region, because that's where there's much higher checks and vigilance. And also there's these two cities and the oblasts attract almost a little more than 50% of all migrants. So then Russian government started cracking down on corruption, and what did they do? Again, in 2013, the mayoral election in Moscow was fought basically on this anti-migration struggle, this idea that migrants are bringing in all kinds of problems and they are illegal and we should throw them out and so on, and all this rhetoric. And then Moscow's mayor Sobyanin, who won the election, and incidentally Navalny, who was the opposition figure, he even outbidded Sobyanin in terms of use of anti-migrant rhetoric. So people who see Navalny as a Democrat were quite surprised and actually disappointed, including somebody like me, that Navalny is not really a solution or an alternative, because it's a bad alternative. It comes with its new set of problems. Anyway, so Sobyanin, it was a very tactical anti-migrant campaign. The aim of Moscow's mayor Sobyanin was to take over the migrant registration business from the Federal Migration Service and place it within the Moscow administration. So that means under his direct control. We are also talking about informal control. So Sobyanin himself also benefits, and all those people around him also benefit personally. and lots of other people in the government. And he succeeded in that. So he said, let's set up a one-stop migration center where everything, fingerprints, documents, health checks, Russian language tests, everything can be done in one place. And that place is a little outside of Moscow. I visited there. I'll tell you a bit more about that later. So in this way, all this revenue started going through this place, through this one-stop center to the Moscow government, and then subsequently in St. Petersburg to the St. Petersburg government. And the Federal Migration Office started losing its revenues. So we also see that it's not just under the guise of crackdown on corruption and reforming the system and trying to legalize migrants. What is happening is that different bodies of the state are also fighting among themselves, and they're fighting for control over migrants. They're fighting for the control of migrant legalization and for the revenues that they can get out of it. This may not be clear, but this is in the one-stop migration center. There's this chart which tells the migrant, you go here for health check, you go here for patent, you go here. And it's tried to systematize everything else. So what we see is, again, there is, this was also a very instrumental ploy, because at that time Russia's economy is already declining. A lot of migrants are there. And the Russian government is trying while they can, they're trying to get more revenue out of migrants. And also one way of scoring public opinion, of getting public support, is to be, we talked about performance. Scott was talking about performance, and Abel talked about performance. You referred to the work of Yurchak, about performance, and what John Heathershaw talks about, the performance state, how the state wants to be seen as performing, as doing the right thing, as evicting the illegal migrants. So this is what the Russian state started doing. So they introduced these laws which said, suddenly they just came out of nowhere, which said that any migrant who has committed more than 2 administrative violations will automatically be deported. So it's not that the court is issuing a deportation order. The database already issues the order, says blacklist, that this person is now ineligible to re-enter. So say if you're a migrant, you overstayed by a few days, or you committed a traffic violation, you are a taxi driver, you got a traffic or parking ticket, or something else. So the police thought that you are drunk, but you are not drunk. I've met migrants who said I was drinking a Coke and I had a Coke bottle, but the police said, you are drunk. I couldn't prove anything to the police. So then, he bribed the police, but that one violation charge was already on his document. So after 2 violations, the migrants are automatically blacklisted. So what that meant is, when migrants go home once a year, and many of them, they try to re-enter, at the airport, they were told, no, you don't have permission to re-enter because you have committed some crime. And then later on, they found out what was it they committed. So almost 1 million people were rendered deportable. So some of them still remain in Russia. They knew that they have committed crime, but they knew that if they go, they can't come back. So they simply stayed on. So that led to a drop in number of migrants entering. And this way, what the state is doing, the state is creating this illusion that there are all these migrants are deported, but in real life, they have not been deported because the state doesn't have the money to deport them. You can't just say you are deported. You have to provide people with tickets, and that doesn't exist. So a lot of these people with deported orders are actually in Russia. But the statistics says that they are deported, and the public opinion says that the state has successfully deported all these people. Other thing that they did, the Ministry of Interior blamed the Federal Migration Service, and it was abolished, and its functions were taken by the Ministry of Interior. Anyway, these are just some pictures. This person is telling me not to take his picture because he doesn't want to be seen. Then also you see that how police on the street start checking documents of migrants. It's not legal, but it's not illegal also. And even one court judge actually issued the order when he was told, when the lawyer said, that this is illegal, and the judge said, yeah, but it's a widespread practice. So, if everyone knows, the migrants should know that the police will check them on the street, and they should know what the widespread practices are. So the judge himself was actually, privileging widespread practices to what is said, written in the laws. So all these checks are very rampant. This is, by the way, St. Petersburg. This is also 2013-14. It just shows this very state-sanctioned anti-migrant propaganda. So a group of nationalists, very small number, they were allowed to have this march, and they were carrying all these very impressive kind of placards and posters saying, Nikovo ni nada, remove them all from here. We don't need their work. So you know how migrants are portrayed as brooms and cleaning kind of instruments, and then other people saying, we won't allow Moscow to be turned into a Moskvabad. We don't need, this Moskvabad because of migrants. And Moskva gastiam ne verit. You can't see the whole thing. The movie Moscow doesn't believe in tears. Moskva slizam ne verit. Moskva gastiam ne verit. So all these ghosts, we don't need all these guests. So this was all state sanctioned. This doesn't mean that there is anti-migrant opinion in Russia, but a lot of that is fueled by the state, fueled by the media for specific purposes. It can be switched on and off also by the state and media when they think it's necessary. That's very important. I think I'm running out of time. I've already used up the 50 minutes, right? 3 more minutes left? Okay. So what we are seeing here, the purpose of Patyent was to legalize and to generate revenues. So the revenues are being generated. The state did, Moscow especially got a lot of money from this, but they haven't legalized, and it's in the interest of the state to continue to generate a certain group of illegal migrants. Because if everyone is legal, then there's no problem. Then, everything is fine. I mean, so the US is a perfect example. Why does Trump have to now build this wall and do all these ridiculous things? Because, you can't allow migrants to become legal. You have to keep talking about illegal, deportable migrants. So as the Genova, a very well-known anthropologist who has worked on this migrant deportability, who says that we actually have to look into the structure and the content of the laws themselves to find illegality, and how the laws are generative of illegalities rather than legality. The purpose of immigration law becomes to produce various forms of illegalities in order to deport, and there's a much broader logic. So the migrants have to be subjected to the ever-looming threat of deportability, and that's what the law does. And migrants are at the same time cheap, disposable, deportable labor, and that's how they are beneficial. And that's how especially so-called illegal or informal migration benefits the economy. So you cannot acquire perfect legality through law. That's why in the US, other democratic states, you have a lot of other civil society organizations, migrants organizations, churches and mosques and religious institutions, human rights lawyers, immigration lawyers, who are fighting for migrants' rights, and who are even violating the existing laws because they think that the moral claim is more important than the limited frame of these so-called laws. But you don't have that climate in Russia. So the law continues to generate all these very artificially problematic dichotomies between illegal and legal, when the laws themselves are very illegal in origin. And ethnoracial profiling of migrants that you saw, and we still don't have reliable number of migrants. And then there is also, on the basis of this, this kind of production of illegality, there's so many, this idea that is being bandied around, there are so many illegal migrants, and that's why there's violation of law and order, that's why there are all these diseases and dirt and squalor and criminality and so on, and terrorist threats and Islamization. So all these things get interlinked. So the next step of this is the production of this threat and the securitization of migration. So with the changes that took place in migration regulation in Moscow, in the rest of the country, we see that progressively the Ministry of Interior, which is a Silovik structure, the strong men. Everyone knows the word Silovik, right? Siloviki in Russia. The KGB, the ex-KGB people, the security structure, police, Ministry of Interior, and others. So they are running the state, and they are also now running, have taken charge of migration, because it's also a very lucrative business. That's my argument, among other things. It's a very lucrative business for the state, for the state structures. And just before the football competition, of course, the state was genuinely interested, and I think any state organizing such a big event would be quite concerned about taking the appropriate security measures. So I remember in 2012 Olympics in London, also there were these enhanced security measures. But what happened in Russia was something much more than the average security measures. So there were very strict limits put on migrants' term of stay, And basically, the Kyrgyz and the Tajik embassies were writing to their migrants saying, just try not to show up anywhere near the football places, any football stadium or anything. Just try not to be seen in public because you will be arrested. So enhanced control, policing, but it was also a way of Ministry of Interior getting more and more money from the state so that they could implement these measures. And how much of money was divided among the top people, how much was spent on actual security measures, we don't know. But this is how everything happens. When the state gives funding for something, a lot of money gets siphoned off, as they say in Russia, atkat. So the atkat goes to the officials. So we see, I'll just leave this for you to think about when we talk about the securitization of migration by the state, the production of threat, migrant as a threat. It doesn't just happen just in kind of an empty, in just any social context. You have to have some other things going on in society in order to make people believe that this is a credible threat, in order to convince people that migration is the problem, not anything else, but migration is the problem. And the same thing happened with the Brexit debate in the UK, right? The vote was on Brexit, and suddenly it became a vote on migration. And Brexit completely got linked to the migration policy. And people like Nigel Farage and all this UKIP party people said, we need to have control, we don't need so many migrants. So that wasn't really an initial issue. So it's very easy to see how migration becomes the mirror that becomes, where all kind of social problems get reflected and get identified with. So Russia has been undergoing demographic decline. Its demography situation is not going to get any better, and its demographers are warning that if nothing is done, if Russia doesn't accept migrants, and if the birth rate doesn't improve, and if Russians continue to emigrate, by 2050, Russia will be 17th, 18th in terms of population. So Vietnam, Ethiopia, all these states would have more people than Russia. Economic recession, Russia's economy is not growing in the foreseeable future. Dependence on migrant labor, yes, it's not going to decrease. The regime seeking popular support, yes, it needs more and more popular support because its base is not very legitimate. Anti-migrant opinion is a very easy thing to arouse through media because that system already exists. Punitive migration policy, and also there's lack of policy of integration. So it becomes much easier to criminalize and securitize migrants. Just a couple of pictures and then I'll stop. This is just, this is actually Russian Cossack. It says that, even if the migrant gets Russian passport, he doesn't become, the passport doesn't make him a citizen. So, even if the migrant, getting citizenship is seen as a marker of integration. But he's saying, just because the Uzbek or Tajik has a passport doesn't mean he's the citizen. I think I'll show you some other pictures, but just to sum up what I have said, does Russia have a migration policy? Well, many states don't have a coherent migration policy, and that includes Britain. But so I won't single out Russia's migration policy problems, but Russia has more than its share of lack of coherence in its migration policy. In 2012, Putin adopted this concept of migration, which was very nice, very liberal, very promising. And he said, yes, we do have a problem attracting migrants. And yes, we have to get more students and more skilled migrants and all those things. And what happened just a year later? All these restrictions, much more punitive regime, increased ethno-racial profiling of migrants for checks, corruption cycle, and wave of deportations. But at the same time, the state gets a lot of money from migrants. I remember last year, the Moscow's mayor Sobyanin made a statement. Time to time, his office has to release some statistics, and he said Moscow has about 2.5 million migrant workers. And he said, yes, we have so many migrant workers, but unfortunately, and he said Moscow made some huge amount, I forget what was the profit, they collected from taxes from the patent, which was more than the taxes paid by oil and gas companies to the state budget. So he cited all those wonderful figures saying how much Moscow administration has gained from the patent revenues. And there are 2.5 million migrants. And he said, unfortunately, we have to rely on migrant workers. So that unfortunately, he was almost apologizing to Moscovites saying, allow me to hire migrants because unfortunately we need them. Otherwise, almost we can't guarantee you clean streets and all that. So that's kind of, so they need the money from migrants. And at the same time, last year, the concept, the amendment that Russian state came out with, which was very bizarre, a lot of Russian academics and scholars working on this, they said we were not consulted, we have no idea where this amendment came from, which said that Russia is going to protect Russian culture from invasion by migrants, and the priority would be given to Russian Slavic migrants. So basically and now of course Putin has granted all this refugee status, and Russian passports are being distributed to people, Ukrainians in the war zone. So that's the idea, that a lot of Ukrainians can be given Russian passports. So, and they would do all the work that migrants, I mean, it's a very short-sighted and it's a very ill-thought policy, but anyway, that's what the Russian government is doing. And they have also started inviting some of the old believers, Starovertsi from Argentina and Brazil and elsewhere, few families, and the media kind of shows them in pays them great attention. And finally, what we see is, based on this, what are the key elements of migration discourse that we can identify here? So the discourse, first and foremost, is a state-centric discourse. There are no other stakeholders, prominent stakeholders, who are shaping this discourse. So there's a weakness or almost absence of a normative migrants' right discourse. And it's framed in terms of nationalism, public safety, order, security, racial, civilizational categories. So, Russia should have Slavic people, that kind of, discourse. And migrants are the source of corruption. But there is an underlying economic rationality to it, that migrants, everyone knows that migrants currently provide the cheap, dispensable, deportable labor. It's also media-produced discourse. There are, again, no other people who are prominent, who are not, other groups are not allowed to speak, the pro-migrant groups. And finally, migration is always defined as a problem by the state. So just when I went to one of these migration centers 2 years ago to look at what's happening, and the director of the migration center in Moscow, the director and the deputy came out because somebody reported to them that a foreigner has been interviewing all these people, and I was with a friend who is a human rights lawyer in Moscow. So this director and her deputy came along and said, "What are you doing here?" So I said, "Well, excuse me, I'm just, I'm doing study of economy and everything. And where are you from?" And then she said, "Do you have the permission of the Ministry of Interior?" I said, "I didn't know I needed a permission to come here. It's a free territory." And she said, "So where are you from?" And then she told me, she said, "So you want to study migration problem here?" And she said, "Don't even get me started on migration problems in your country." I mean, pointing fingers at me. "Don't even get me started. We know what's happening in your country. We know what's happening in Europe. We are trying to create order. We don't have this kind of anarchy and disorder as it is in your country. Allow us to work. Don't come here and don't disturb us and don't distract us. Just go away." So I had to leave. So migration is a problem, but we are trying to solve it in the best way, in the ways that Europe doesn't know how to solve. That's also other thing. These are something later. I'll just quickly, I think I had some other pictures. They seem to have disappeared, but anyway. I'll make what I'll do, I'll stop here. I'll take some questions, and if we have time, we'll have a little break, and then I'll show you the next set of slides. Okay?
Great. Thank you very much.
I don't know how much time. Okay. Yeah, so this part focuses on the effects on the three states from which the most number of migrants are coming: Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and also the effects of migration. I'm also going to talk here about this whole idea about how migration tends to radicalize migrant workers abroad, so a little bit, because, the reason, because a lot of that is kind of flagged in media these days. So I will touch upon that and show you some photos which will tell you the further story that the words cannot tell effectively, and then have discussions. So just prepare your questions, because I won't touch upon too many things in detail. So, I already mentioned the benefits, economic and other benefits of migration to Russia, both informally as well as formally. So formally in terms of the increased revenues from the taxes on migrants which the governments are gaining, And there are also much larger tangible benefits that cheap migrant labor brings into Russia, which are not even properly studied and counted by economists and demographers and others in Russia. But in terms of the benefits and the effects of migration on the migrant donor or migrant sending states, I don't like to use the word migrant sending states because it implies that the states are sending the migrants. In fact, states are not sending them. Migrants are going on their own. Migrant donor state also is not really a good word, but I just kind of for convenience chose that because they're not donating migrants, but they're more, the origin states, from which migrants originate. So one most effective, most visible effect is the remittances that is sent by migrants to these states. Денежные переводы. For a long time, we see that the GDP of these three states, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, has a very sizable share of migrant remittances. So some 4 years ago, almost that 47%, 48% of Tajikistan's GDP comprised of migrant remittances, but now that figure has fallen to something like 40, 45, 48 was long time, some 4 years ago. Now it's probably close to 40, 41%. So it changes year by year depending on how Russia's economy is doing, depending on how what the value of the ruble is, depending on how much money migrants have to spend in Russia to remain legal, to all these transaction costs, and what pay they are getting. And also there are more migrants whose families are moving now to Russia. So they are sending less money because the family is with them. So the decrease in the remittances doesn't necessarily mean that the migrants are earning less. It may also mean in some cases that the families are moving to Russia. But you have these figures about roughly the share of the remittances on the economy and some idea of the decline in the remittances which are visible in last 3 years as a result of the stringent policies and growing corruption and growing cost of working legally in Russia. This gives us some idea until 2016 about the kind of the peak and the ebb in the remittances, the share of remittances. But basically you see that from 2016 the share of remittances is declining, and it was the highest between 2011 to 2014 or so. Socio-economic effects of remittances beyond the share in the GDP. One question that's always debated in the literature on development is in what ways in what ways remittances aid development in the home state. It's a huge topic, but just to identify some very key points, remittances they have proven to have a positive effect in terms of poverty alleviation, improving standards of living, and as a result also diffusion of social tensions in these home states. There is also reduced, as a result, there's also reduced potential for social protest and mobilization here. So just try to imagine if all these three states have about 70% or more population which is young, which is just joining the labor market or which has just joined the labor market. And just imagine if they did not have the outlet of working in Russia, and if they were employed in home in underpaid jobs or underemployed or unemployed, then there would be a lot more frustration, a lot more poverty, and much more room for radicalization and anti-government, and a lot of demands made on the state. So migration has made it very easy for the state to do less, to not provide much social help, educational, to spend much in development. So there is, so we see the positive effect that it reduces poverty in specific families, but also it's a question mark whether this leads to more investment in the local community infrastructure, because migrants tend to spend more on improving their own family situations, but less so for improving the situation of their village or so. And even there are cases in which some migrants well-off who are willing to do that, they encounter a lot of bureaucratic obstacles from the local officials who want a bigger chunk from that for their own benefit. So there are many of these problems. So even if you want to do some charity and welfare, you have to deal with the corruption in your local society. And the state, the negative effect is that the state abdicates its responsibility. In case of Tajikistan, what we have seen is, what is the Tajik government spending money on if 47% of the GDP share is coming from remittances? It's spending money on constructing a huge, gigantic flagpole, which is considered to be the largest in the world on the Guinness Book of Records. It's building a huge, sorry?
They've had the tallest, but now the Saudis have the tallest.
Oh, so all the money spent has not delivered the benefits. Azerbaijan. So, right. Thank you for that. So Azerbaijan is not doing all that greatly either. So and now they are building a huge chaikhana in Tajikistan. I mean Dushanbe. I don't know what's the latest on that. So and there's also investment in the coercive, in enhancing the coercive surveillance capacity of the state. So increased authoritarian trend. And there are many other social costs of remittances. They are multifarious. Breakup of families, lots of migrants. I have interviewed many who have young migrants, who have their spouses back home for a variety of reasons, for purpose of visa, residency, everything. They marry a Russian citizen. Or, there are many, I know, cases in which the mother of this Uzbek migrant herself told him, you don't be alone, you need a woman. So he had an Armenian woman, then he broke up, then he found a Russian, and he has been to 3-4 such relationships. I don't know. So, and then he acquired residency. So mother-in-law also, the mothers encourage their sons to acquire a second wife and not tell the daughter-in-law, while the daughter-in-law is raising the family. So those situations are they're not uncommon. Breakup of families and basically the fragmentation of also the social structure that progressively happens because of the translocal kind of nature of migrants. The policies of these states, again, I think in a kind of in a nutshell, what we find that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, their governments have gradually, grudgingly accepted that migration, labor migration is a fact of life. So they have tried to make conditions easier for citizens to work abroad. So Tajikistan and Russia have a treaty on dual citizenship. It doesn't mean much in terms of international law, this dual citizenship, because the Tajik can have both Russian and Tajik passports, but that is a local passport. It's not the Zagran passport. Yeah. So if you want to go abroad to a visa, if you want to get a visa, then you have to have a foreign passport. So that dual passport is more symbolic than real, but it means something. It offers some psychological security, and for a lot of people, passport is actually a very symbolic, emotional document. Benedict Anderson, who has written on nationalism, he wrote in one of his works where he says that passport is the most counterfeit document because it masks one's identity, national identity. It is often in globalized world, it's often used to mask one's identity rather than to flag it. I'll give you one example. Maybe I'm taking time. A cousin of mine who many years ago, he was working in the US, didn't really like, at age 51, he decided to retire and go back to India. He was writing poetry, he was running a motel. He never wore suit or tie in his entire lifetime. Then he decided to go to India, and he felt that he had Indian passport, but then and US green card. Then he decided, for reasons of convenience and because his son and daughter were in the US, he should get US citizenship and then go to India so that he can return to the US. So he went for his US passport and his interview. There's an interview for US citizenship test. So he used to have a beard. This was post 9/11, immediate in 2002. He shaved off his beard and he had suit and tie, and he gave the interview, and his passport has this very nice picture of him. We have never seen him in wearing suit and tie, and then he came back. So that's a perfect example of somebody on passport flagging a counterfeit identity. So I don't mean counterfeit in illegal sense, but an identity that's not his own, but the US passport is convenient to him. And he has an Indian document which allows him to stay, so everything is fine. So anyway, I think I could go on about this, but I won't. But there are so many stories about Central Asians acquiring multiple passports or dual or other passports or buying. There are apparently Russian passports available, in Kyrgyzstan. People are selling counterfeit documents. But yeah, so in terms of policy, Uzbekistan has had a slightly different, quite different attitude towards migration, especially under Karimov, who outrightly ignored migration as a fact. And he even made many statements saying that the migrants who work in Russia, the Uzbeks who work in Russia, are lazy, they are greedy, they want easy money, and they are degrading themselves by doing all these jobs. And they are degrading, undermining the reputation of Uzbekistan. Anyway, so, and the Uzbek embassy made life miserable for Uzbek migrants. So I have done research, I've seen the queues of Uzbeks outside of Uzbek embassy in Moscow and Almaty. And they, even for many, many years, the Uzbeks did not even move their embassy to Astana. Only recently they moved. And only last 2 years, they have started opening consulates in other cities, Novosibirsk and Vladivostok, and as they didn't even have consulates in other cities. So, you know, if you're migrant, Uzbek migrant working in Novosibirsk, you lost your document or whatever, you have to go all the way to Moscow. But now under Mirziyoyev, there are changes, and he's appreciating the role of migrants and trying to conclude some agreements with Russia and also agreements with other states from New Zealand to Emirates to India, others to send Uzbek migrants. And finally, I won't talk much about it because I've already said this, and I want to talk about something more. So the slump in migration has led to shrinking share of remittances, and it has become more costly for migrants to work in Russia. Many are acquiring huge debts in order to pay for patent and get money, the initial capital, the startup capital you need to go to Russia to settle in there. And they're getting, a lot of them are borrowing at huge percentage and not understanding what's involved. And then Russia also has considerable geopolitical control. So if there is any dispute between Tajikistan and Russia on anything, Russia can threaten that they will expel Tajik migrants. I mean, they don't have the capacity to expel, to deport, or even to find out where the Tajik migrants are. But rhetorically, that threat is very powerful. So every time Rahmon meets with Putin, and the last meeting he pleaded with Putin to lift the re-entry bans and deportation orders for a number of Tajiks. So it's an important geopolitical tool for Russia. And finally, maybe last 3 minutes, and then the pictures will tell the story. There's a lot of discussion about migrants' radicalization, and I find it difficult to talk about it because I think the problem gets taken out of the context, and because there are a lot of media sources who are interested in how many Central Asians and others are joining ISIS and Islamic State and other radical groups. And there are people who don't know much about this come out with some figures of how many thousands of people joined. So 2,000 to 4,000 Central Asians joined ISIS. What does that mean? I mean, there are more, in terms of the number and percentage, there are more British citizens and European citizens who have joined the ISIS and similar outfits than the Central Asians. So these numbers don't tell us anything, anything revealing. And we shouldn't really go by these numbers. So the share of Central Asians is not conspicuous. There isn't any reliable evidence of strong entrenched terrorist networks in Central Asia or in Russia, which is not to say that they don't exist or there are not efforts to establish them. It's an ongoing battle between the police officials and the people trying, recruiting and setting up these networks. And there are also local Russian citizens, Chechens and Dagestanis, who are also quite active in terms of trying to recruit migrants. And there are a lot of these activities that go around the mosques in major cities. I'll just show you some pictures. But most important, the recruitment that takes place, the radicalization that is taking place. Undoubtedly, it's taking place in all European cities among migrants. So Russia is no exception. It's taking place also as a result of transnational propaganda. I have seen so many migrants who are plugged into social media, who are quite aware. I mean, I was interviewing somebody, and one Dagestani migrant, and he was filling out some social media, some survey, which was about the mosque that was demolished in 1991 by the Hindu nationalists. And the survey asked in Russian, in Arabic, and in Hindi, and in Bengali and other languages, questions, do you think that mosque should be rebuilt? Do you think the mosque should be rebuilt next to the temple? Do you think the temple should be destroyed and the mosque should be rebuilt? And this Dagestani I knew, he wrote, the temple should be destroyed and the mosque should be rebuilt. So, you know, how does a Dagestani know about the mosque in India? Or even more important, when there was the Rohingya crisis, there was a huge demonstration in Moscow organized by some Chechen Kadyrov groups in support of the Rohingya. Now, what do average Chechens, Dagestani, average Russian citizens know about Rohingya? They are not mobilizing for rights of their own migrants, because this was supported by the Kadyrov people to show this Islamic solidarity and everything. And so anyway, I think the point here is that these transnational and also state-led propaganda can also create this kind of support. So lastly, just let me end with some of these pictures. This is the Central Cathedral Mosque in Moscow. This was just start of Ramadan period then. There are many other photos, but very tight police security checks for everyone who's going in. Then just some pictures I took. I was accompanied by a Dagestani friend of mine who often kind of acts as my male companion, bodyguard, supporter, whoever. So otherwise, I couldn't just go alone and start taking pictures here. The various material that are being sold in the bookstore. There are a lot of Egyptian Islamic scholars. You know, there's a lot of Salafi literature. There's not much control, so there's a lot of stuff on Caliphate and Sharia state also that gets translated and read by people. This is an example of migrants showing that how integrated they are. So the Irkutsk, the National Day celebration, the city, the foundation of the city day, something, 1st of June. So the Turkmen, Kyrgyz, the Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks are also marching, you know, showing the internationalism of the city. This is just, I spotted this person. Can you see this clearly? It's, I think, he was, maybe, can you read? It says Musulmanin, Muslim. So I just happened to see this person at the metro. So, you know, it's just literally somebody wearing his identity now with confidence, something you couldn't possibly find, you know, 10 years ago. I'll just conclude with my just final observations. What future trends? We find no matter how coercive Russia's migration policy, the fact is that there are already critical number of migrants who have either citizenship or settlement rights or without documentation who are in Russia. It's a fact of life. They can't be, the state doesn't even know exactly how to find them. Central Asian states are also dependent on migration. So Russia is going to depend on migrants for a significant period. It can't get other kind of migrants. You know, it's not able to attract other migrants despite sporadic efforts here and there. And migration is not just something we study for itself, but it's also a very useful lens to study so many processes and changes which are taking place in all these societies, whether in the field of sphere of labor market, national identity, how it's defined, us versus them, citizenship, you know, so many people acquiring passports and dual citizenship, what does that mean actually? Security, regional cooperation under Eurasian Economic Union or bilateral structures on migration, border control, and so on. So migration is not just something in itself that we should focus on, but also a process through which all these processes can be made visible. Just one final on a cheerful or funny note. Somebody was asking me about Russians and of African origin or something. So, you know, when I said there's migrant phobic attitudes in Russia, but also people are curious about migrants. And there's so many, it's silly, but I've seen so many, I mean, people of African, black origin, African Americans who say that when they go to these places, Russia, Kazakhstan, local people come, try to touch them, even children, and, you know, and they say, oh, are you a football player? Or they're just kind of, you know, fascinated by the person's skin and everything. So there is a certain kind of primitive curiosity about this. So this is what I saw once in Arbat, this local, then I found out this woman was visiting from some, you know, Saratov or some other city, and she had never seen a black person, so she just wanted to be filmed, and she liked. but paradoxically, anyway, I think the way in which a lot of Russians find the black Africans exotic and fascinating, but they don't find the Central Asians exotic, fascinating in that way. I'll leave with that kind of broad statement. Thank you.